welcome all for an exciting event with two old friends today. I'm Simon Rosenberg, for those of you who don't know, and welcome to NDN NPI. We are a think tank here in Washington, and we do a few events from time to time. And so if you're watching online or you're here today for the first time, stay in touch, because there will be a lot of things we'll be announcing soon for the coming months. Today, I'm excited to be hosting a conversation about a cutting-edge subject that I think is really, we were joking earlier, that is a little bit in its manifestation right now in Washington, a little bit geeky and nerdy. However, it really speaks to a much bigger moment in the evolution of geopolitics in the 21st century, which is this idea that I think that one of the great ideological struggles that we may see play out in this emerging century is not so much left versus right, like what we saw throughout the 20th century, but open and closed. And this notion that what we have is sort of two different theories of how states relate to their people. And we have the open US model, and then there are alternative models, perhaps most exemplified by Iran and China right now, who are presenting a different model of how these states relate to their own people. And the reason this becomes so important is that the tools that are available today, and that we're in this arc where we're moving from an age of sort of top-down, TV broadcast kind of communications to one that's more bottom-up and more where everyone in the world will be connected through very powerful tools in the next few years, is that the threat that these tools present to closed societies are more significant than any other set of tools, really, that we've seen, I would argue, in the modern era, right? Not a big assertion, and it's one of the reasons I think you're seeing countries like Iran and China become more reactionary to the use of these tools by their citizens, because the threat that they present to undermining the ability for a closed society to operate are becoming more intense. And I think that, so the context of this discussion today, which is going to be about a very specific aspect of this sort of open and closed narrative, which is about how do we create governments in the 21st century that are more open and more respectful of our people, that are sharing the information that they have more effectively with citizens in order to produce a better society, in essence, right? And I think that what I'm excited is that we have two leading experts on this, representing the two countries that are moving furthest ahead on this here in the United States, with the Obama administration and our very good friend Andrew McLaughlin, Deputy CTO in the White House, who's going to be talking about the initiatives in the Obama administration, but also James Crabtree, a former fellow here at NDN, who's back living in London, writing for Prospect, or helping edit Prospect magazine, who's getting his fingers dirty, or putting his fingers in all sorts of cookie jars in British politics right now. And what's exciting is that he'll be reporting in and sort of summarizing an article that he recently wrote. And what's interesting to me is that it's possible that the UK is actually ahead of us on this. And we have a lot to learn, I think, here in the US from what's happening with the open government, open data discussion in Britain, but also how it's playing out in politics. I mean, what's interesting is that this has not yet really become a major issue in the political discourse in the US and sort of the elections, and I think it will be. I mean, I think you're starting to hear, for example, the Tea Party folks talk about the need for openness and accountability and all that. But I think that in Britain, in the upcoming race between the Labour Party and the Tories, is that this has become a central battleground in an upcoming election. And I think that's going to be, I think we have a lot to learn from James today. So let me turn it over to our two speakers, and there's going to be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. And for those of you watching online, you'll be able to send, if you follow the instructions on the web, you can send questions in that we can get here and hopefully answer them intelligently. So welcome, everybody. Thank you, Andrew. Come on up. Thanks, brother.
So let me start off by saying thanks to Simon. Simon has a long history here in DC, and a long history as an entrepreneur. I remember in his famous book, Code, Larry Lessig dedicated the book to Charlie Nesson with the inscription, "To Charlie Nesson, whose every idea seems crazy for about a year." And in Simon's case, the way that you might write the inscription is, to Simon Rosenberg, whose every idea seems super geeky for about 2 years, and then becomes mainstream. And it's been the pioneering work that you've done actually at the intersection of politics and technology that in some sense has brought us here today. It mainstreamed a bunch of things that seemed very foreign in the Washington environment. In a lot of ways, you've been most responsible for bringing Silicon Valley and Washington together. So my being here in some sense I should blame on you. What Simon just said is absolutely right, which is that there is an underlying urgency to what we're talking about today, which is a political, grand strategic urgency for the United States, which is that we find ourselves in a global competition among other models for society. And the imperative to make our model work, of course, is in order to bring economic growth, prosperity, political stability, and so forth to our citizens, and for the freedom and the rights that protect the freedom and the rights that we enjoy. But if we're going to accomplish that, we've got to renew this government. We have to renew this system of administration that we've got. We have to make the American people feel that the government is, in fact, working for them. And so when we talk about openness, we're talking about kind of a broader set of things than just simply open doors and windows that allow you to see what's going on. It's actually trying to deliver a government that functions dramatically better than what we've been used to. From the very small, rudimentary tasks of everyday interaction with the government, like getting your licenses renewed online so you don't have to wait in line anymore, to the grand policymaking functions of the federal government, like how much should we tax and whom should we tax. All of those interactions, I think, are susceptible to being retooled and improved through technology. Let me start off by trying to set the context for where we are today. I just want to say a few words about why it is that open government is becoming a big, sexy topic now. And a lot of it has to do with really the technology itself and where it's come from and how far it's come. The prediction that Gordon Moore, who started Intel, made in 1964, which has become known as Moore's Law, was the prediction that the number of transistors that you could fit onto a chip would double roughly every 18 to 24 months. What that means in practice is that the power of a given unit of chip, so the same size and money chip, doubles about every 18 to 24 months. Or the amount of computing power that you can get doubles every 18 to 24 months for the same amount of money, or that your costs go in half every 18 to 24 months. So anyway, this prediction, which is described as a law, but is really just a prediction, is proven to be miraculously true over the last 40, 45 years. There's endless debate about whether it's going to continue indefinitely, but it has proven to be true. So what this means is that the same size and price chip basically gets 10 times bigger, better every 5 years. And a way to think about that in just practical terms is to compare the computer industry or the technology industry, broadly speaking, with the automobile industry. If we had had the same rate of improvement in the auto industry, a brand new car that cost you $20,000 in 2005 would cost you $2,000 today, new, and would cost you $200 in 2015, new. You could get the exact same car. That's the rate of change that we've had. Another way to think about this is that right now, you can go and spend about $190 at Best Buy and buy a terabyte of memory that will sit in the corner of your desk and back up your computer. As recently as 1993, a terabyte of memory would have cost you about $2.5 or $3 million, and it would have taken a refrigerator-sized stack of motherboards to deliver. So anyway, that's how far we've come. So a lot of this open government stuff that we are talking about is because the cost of information has plunged. The cost of creating information, the cost of distributing information via the internet, the cost of accessing that information through your mobile phone or whatever you might have gets smaller and smaller. When I was back at Google, one of the big surprises was to realize that it was in a declining cost business. Each unit of computing power was cheaper this year than it was the year before. So the metaphor then that I want to highlight, the kind of metaphor for the transformation that is possible technologically now, is the transition from the telephone network to the internet, from the PSTN, or the public switch telephone network that we all grew up with, to the TCP/IP world that we are now living in. And what I mean by that metaphorically is that the PSTN was characterized as being a closed network. It was a channel-switched network. A dedicated channel had to be opened between each point on the network that wanted to communicate with each other. It was centralized. It was tightly controlled. It was largely built on proprietary technology developed by the telecom companies themselves with some standards that they used to interconnect with each other. It was a hardened network that produced astonishing levels of achievement in uptime, for example, but built around a hardened model. And it was vertically integrated. Broadly, you can say that it was a network where the power lay in the core. It was a core-powered network. The sum total of innovation, for a couple of decades in the telephone network was voicemail and call forwarding. That was it, because those were changes that could be implemented at the core of the network while everybody retained the little 12-button, speaker in, speaker out little boxes that they had sitting at their homes. So we've now moved to a TCP/IP world where where the telecom companies and the ISPs and others provide network services that are characterized as being open. They are packet switched. They are decentralized networks. They are distributed in terms of power. They are standards-based. They are resilient rather than hardened. And they're built on a layers model where the application layer can be provided by somebody other than the provider of the hardware. The service is different from the hardware. And so what that means is power is now at the edge. So I, with this laptop sitting in front of me here, can decide what applications I want to run, what programs I want to download, what I want to do with it, who I want to talk to, and so forth and so on. So that's metaphorically the world that we've moved into. We've gone from a PSTN to a TCP/IP world. And there are these very interesting parallels in other parts of the world that are going through the same kind of a transition. If you look at air traffic control, we're in the middle of a large multi-year switch from the traditional air traffic control system to a new system in which planes will be empowered to fly direct routes rather than having to follow squawk radio corridors across the country. They will be in direct satellite communication. They will be able to sense other airplanes around them. They'll be able to communicate directly if need be. In general, your flights should be faster, more efficient, less prone to congestion, all because we've made airplanes more autonomous and given them more channels and paths of communication that they can use to reach their destination. It's almost like they're becoming packet switched rather than circuit switched. Similarly, we're trying to pull off something like this in emergency responder communications, which is instead of having emergency responders rely on these old push-to-talk Motorola devices, you want to give them a multiplicity of ways to get their communications out. If the Verizon wireless network is the one that is strongest and best for them, they should have a device that can talk to that, or do a push-to-talk, or mesh their way out to a tower, and then to a police car nearby, and so forth. So again, it's putting power in the edge of the system rather than concentrating in the core. So the question for government is, can government move from a core-controlled to an edge-empowering system? The way Tim O'Reilly says this is, can government become a platform? So do the things that it uniquely can do, but then leave everything else to people out in the world. So the project then for government that captures this is what we call the Government 2.0 project. This is the project of trying to achieve transparency, participation, collaboration, and efficiency and effectiveness using the technologies that I've just described, using Moore's Law, using these new architectural models of power to the edge. So I'm going to basically skip over the examples that I usually drill into here because I think a lot of them will be obvious, and I'm going to do a little bit of showing and telling later. But let me highlight a couple of the state examples that are interesting. We've seen places like Washington, where we are today, do all kinds of interesting things with data that follows the model that I just described. A great one is something that they call CapStat. Most of you probably haven't used this, but I recommend that you check it out sometime. Basically, what CapStat does is it tries to take real-time government data, real-time data that's coming into the government, and put it out on maps so that people can see what's going on. So if you do if you do a Bing search for this and you find the CapStat page, what you'll see is a map that shows different chunks of DC, and then you can choose different data layers. And among the data layers that you can choose to see in whatever area you want to see are things like 311 calls. So every time somebody calls the city 311 number to report a pothole or a meter is broken or whatever they want to report, it immediately gets ticketed by the person taking the phone call, so they assign it to some agency, and then you can look on a map and see what the complaint was, where it is, and you get to see who it was assigned to, what agency is responsible for following up. This kind of technology has allowed, when he was mayor, Martin O'Malley in Baltimore, to make a 48-hour pothole guarantee. And part of the way that they did it was by making this whole process open to the public so that citizens could learn what to expect and what to do. What are the obstacles to achieving this sort of thing? There are many. I won't go into them in grave detail. Let me just point out a couple of things which get in the way. We have all of these excruciating procurement and acquisition rules in the federal government that make it very difficult to use standard Web 2.0 services in government. So let's suppose you want to, put up a profile page for an agency on Facebook. One of the first questions that the procurement lawyers ask is, well, do we need to competitively bid that? Does Facebook need to come in and competitively bid to be the provider of a homepage service to the federal government? Because they're providing a service, it's for free, and maybe some other social network like Orkut or something wants to come in and bid for it anyway. Well, it's completely nonsense because, right, it's a community that exists and you want to tap into it, and we've had to work our way through that. Similarly, agencies are prevented from, and appropriately so, should not be carrying advertising. And so if an agency has a website or an advertising-supported free web service, is that agency going to be associated with the ads that are running on it, and could that lead to some implication that the agency blesses or favors them, which is what we have rules to stop. There are even problems with things like indemnification provisions and legal jurisdiction and venue, which come in the terms of use, the sort of standard terms of use agreements that you have to click on websites. Those agreements will always, for example, say what state law applies to disputes under the terms of use. The federal government can't agree to be bound by any state law, so you can't just randomly sign up for some service that would require you to be bound. It also generally provides for unlimited liability for the user, and the federal government has a law that prevents any government employee from signing up for liability over a certain amount without going through a certain process. So anyway, there's all of these sort of things that get in the way that, where our approach has been to try to solve it through the GSA, or General Services Administration, signing up for one agreement that everybody can sort of get on board with. Anyway, there have been lots of those kinds of headaches which are significantly slowing down our ability to do uptake. So let me get into the strategy and where we are today. For the Obama administration, the strategy has been the following. First, we got a presidential memorandum on open government and transparency out on day one, literally January 21st, 2009. This was President Obama's first executive memorandum. It set forth the transparency, participation, and collaboration principles and set in motion a process that concluded, I shouldn't say concluded, that reached another milestone in December. Over the course of 2009, we decided we were just going to throw stuff out and get things up and running and try to make as many sort of experimental runs at these principles as we could. We launched a website called data.gov, which is basically a place to find machine-readable data feeds. The data here is of wildly varying quality and utility. Some of it is extremely interesting and useful. Some of it is less so, to say it politely. But getting federal agencies in the habit of getting their data up online in, and this is crucial, machine-readable formats that can be remixed, mashed up, borrowed, and put to use by any application developer. That was the principle we wanted to establish. We've gone from 48 data sets on day one to more than 160,000 today, and there are many more yet to come. We put a lot of focus on recovery.gov, which was trying to give very detailed information about where the Recovery Act dollars are going, who's getting them, where they're located. This has been a great exercise because it has shown all of the sort of pluses and minuses. You really can get an astonishing degree of detail about where that money has gone, and yet there are limitations. It's hard to get subcontractor data when you've given the money out to a contractor. Oftentimes the sources of the data are wrong. There was a funny sort of blip in the reporting at one point when people used erroneous zip codes, and so, anyway, there's data quality problems. But of course they were there, and there was, like a CNN 24-hour thing about how we were using imaginary congressional districts or something like that. And isn't that a sign that this whole transparency thing is a fraud? Well, the answer, to this has to be, of course there are going to be screw-ups. Of course some of the data is going to be inaccurate. And part of the beauty of making it all publicly available is that people will tell you when you've got bad data, and then you can go and fix it. If you do, in fact, go and fix it, then the whole process works. If you don't go and fix it, then it really is kind of a sham. And I think the challenge for us is to try to prove that we can rigorously follow up as we get complaints and as we get notifications, and prove that we can really get the data right. Another one which I'm a big fan of is the IT dashboard, which is something my colleague Vivek Kundra has focused on, which is basically a sort of a report card for government IT spending. So each IT project gets listed up here, and has to be graded sort of green light, yellow light, or red light, depending on whether it is on time and ahead of budget, stalled, or over budget and behind schedule. And so this is a first draft. There's still going to be a lot of improvements yet to come on this as we get, again, better data, get people in the habit of reporting and so forth. But the idea is, for a lot of the money that government spends, you should be able to go and see on highway dollars, on IT spending, and anyway, anything you can think of. How's the project doing? Are we getting value for money? What Secretary Shinseki at the Veterans Administration did was he was able to use an effort like this, not the same one, but an effort like this, to freeze, $21 million, 121? Now I'm forgetting. Actually, I think I have this in my slide. Was able to freeze a whole bunch of spending for projects that were, behind schedule, and here we go. $200 million, sorry, 45 VA projects he was able to identify and freeze because they were so far behind schedule and so off of the deliverables that they were supposed to be providing. A new one that we just launched, which I'm kind of psyched about, is the OIRA dashboard. You have to be a real government geek to get excited about this, but this is a dashboard where all of the rules that are in process in the federal government have been captured by agency. You can see charts by rule stage. You can see them by the length of review. Oops, that says error in loading data. I wonder if my connection is down. Let me try reloading the page. But anyway, what it allows you to do is see, again, with very fine-grained detail, and the ability, by the way, to, I lost my internet connection. That's the problem here. Let me see if I can get it back. Anyway, fine-grained detail, all of the rules that have been proposed, you can kind of graphically see what agencies are hosting them, how long have they been going on for, what's the economic impact, and so forth, and then drill down to see the rule itself, click through the page that allows you to make comments if the comment period is still open, and so forth. Anyway, it's an effort to be pretty transparent about that stuff. On the White House side, I'll just quickly run through. We've put up an Open Government Initiative page, which tries to kind of collect everything that we've got going on. We've done experiments like Open for Questions with the President, where we let anybody submit a question. People could vote thumbs up or thumbs down on each of the questions submitted, and then we posed the top-ranking questions, including, by the way, the marijuana legalization question, which seems to crop up towards the top of every single public consultation that we do. You want to talk about how to create jobs? Legalize it is always one of the suggestions. How should we be, what should the new, program for human spaceflight in NASA be? Turns out that legalizing it has something to do with that. Maybe it's an alternative to human spaceflight. We've put up White House Live, where we're making increasing use of the sort of online ability to sort of do real-time interviews with staff, not just the president, but with staff people that are experts in given areas, take real-time questions in from the web, let people rank them, and then answer those questions. We're trying to make this as accessible as we can. A lot of the agencies, like the Federal Communications Commission, have been doing their own versions of this. So on the net neutrality debate, the Federal Communications Commission put up openinternet.gov. The NTIA put up something called Broadband Match. So they've got a website called Broadband USA, and one of the big issues with the broadband stimulus dollars is, how do you get potential applicants to be able to know about each other and so submit joint applications where it makes sense. So they put up a website called Broadband Match, which allows you to do that. In the health IT area, electronic health records are a big deal. They've done an incredibly transparent process of working groups that meet in public, meet webcasted, take questions online, put proposals out for public comment, and so forth. And at HHS, they've even been doing an interesting open source programming project themselves called Connect, which is an effort to build a set of software tools that will enable hospitals and providers, insurers, and other people to connect with each other. And they do things like codathons, where they just invite open source programmers. There's one coming up in April in Miami. Show up and spend 2 days helping us make this work. And the reason that people do is because this is something that could really make a big difference in the healthcare system if we can get it right. One that I want to mention that I'm just kind of psyched about, and again, it's pretty geeky, is the Federal Register. So one of the things we were able to do this year is get the Federal Register published in XML format. So XML is like machine-readable format. So the reason that this is important is because the Federal Register is everything that the federal government is doing. You know, it gets published in the Federal Register, and it's kind of like official. But it's also 70,000 pages a year. You know, so there are actually businesses, you know, that exist here in Washington where their only job is clients pay them money and they keep up with what's in the Federal Register, and they basically tell their clients, you know, here's the thing that's relevant to you. So that's brain dead, and we've got this out in XML format now, where the value that other people are going to have to provide is going to have to be something better than that. Now, in an XML world, services like FedThread have been launched that allow you to, for example, just enter a search query like your town or your zip code. Or you might be interested in like toxic emissions or something. And now you will get an email every time that a Federal Register item gets posted that includes that search term. Free, right? Doesn't cost anybody anything. It's a brilliant service and the kind of thing that we're hoping to see. All right, so let me wrap up then. So in December, we posted the President announced the Open Government Directive. So this was the more detailed consequence of this initial Open Government Memorandum. And it set a series of deadlines for agencies to get their acts together in various ways, 45, 60, 90, 120. We've now passed the first two of those deadlines. The first one was that agencies should post 3 high-value data sets. They all did that. They're up on data.gov. Not everybody agrees that all of these are high-value data sets. And there's been a robust debate about that. In fact, my friend Jim Harper at the Cato Institute put up grades of the agency's data sets. You can see there are a lot of D's and F's here in terms of how valuable they are. A couple of A's. I do want to note that Executive Office of the President got an A from the Cato Institute. When is the last time that happened? In addition, every agency has now designated a high-level official that is responsible for open government. Their names are listed on the White House website. Every agency has designated a member. Well, these are the senior accountable officials. This is the working group. Every agency has designated a member of an open government working group that the White House is chairing. We've posted a dashboard that is a very early draft of what this is going to look like, but it's basically the similar sort of thing. It's color-coded, green, yellow, red, essentially grading of the agencies on all the criteria that we set. This was pretty easy so far because these are, the things that are pretty high profile. And what we're going to try to do is really drill down on the expectations and requirements that we have of the agencies and publicly show who's doing it and who's not. Every agency has now posted a page that is their url.gov/open. That collects all of the resources, lists the people, shows the contacts, shows what they've got going on at a given moment. Yet to come is going to be a framework for prizes and challenges. That's something that we like using. It's a whole new set of incentives to get people to program things and contribute, free labor in some cases, but to highlight what people can do out in the world with the things that we're doing. And then at 120 days, every agency has to actually publish their own open government plan. So in their own context, what they think they're going to do. And OIRA is going to be publishing a review of government information policies. In other words, the rules and regulations that relate to what we can publish and when, that hopefully will open the floodgates for a lot of the things that have been restricted. So back up to 30,000 feet. The real challenge here is to change the culture of government. So we can provide all the tools that you want to provide, but if people still believe that hoarding information, controlling access to information is how they're going to succeed bureaucratically, we are not going to change the culture of government. People have got to understand that they've got an incentive to share, an incentive to be open, incentive to be collaborative, an incentive to be participatory, and to do that, we've got quite a bit to do. The White House role, of course, is to push. We often call this coordinating, but what this really means is pushing agencies, pushing their policies, pushing their practices, pushing what I think of as new product development. In other words, cooking up new and awesome things that they could be doing that would make them look good, would make their bosses look good, that fit within their budgets. For all the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, a lot of the tools that we're talking about are a lot less expensive than the old Washington model of massive contractor builds you huge dedicated infrastructure and software to run on top of it and maintains it for 10 years at enormous cost. Instead, we're looking at a world where you buy a network connection over here, you buy commodity computing services over there, and then you flexibly build, roll out, and iterate whatever it is you need to meet your needs at the moment. And in terms of changing culture, what I've been saying to government audiences is, ask what machine-readable geodata code and web services your country can give to you, and ask what startups, geodata mashups code and visualizations you can give to your country. So on that note, I will say, with the urgency that we need to change this government in order to compete globally and in order to win that classic battle, that colossal battle of our age, which is open systems versus closed systems, democracies versus top-down authoritarian governments, starting here at home, this is the contribution I think we can make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I find myself doubly intimidated to be here today. Firstly, because it's just about the most high-tech, funky little presentation I think I've ever seen. Secondly, to speak in front of both Andrew and Simon is a bit of a trip. When I was going to grad school 3 or 4 years ago, I went to Boston where Andrew was at the Berkman Center at Harvard, and he sort of held my hand and told me everything was going to be fine. And then when I left grad school and I was looking for a job in Washington, then Simon also sort of held my hand and told me everything was going to be fine. So to present in front of both of them is a great privilege, and I'm very proud to be here, as using Simon's phrase. So I'm going to talk a little bit less about examples and just tell the story of how it is that in my country, open data in particular, less so some of the other things that Andrew talked about, went from being, you know, as you put it before, Nerdistan. This is a geek topic that nobody was interested in, to being what is coming close to being one of the most important political debates that will play out at our next election. And I thought I'd start with a story which I tell in the magazine article, which you can all have a copy of the magazine that I work for, which is called Prospect on the Way Out, which is a story about a woman called Amelia Zoller, who used to be an intern at the think tank that I used to work for, the Institute for Public Policy Research in London. And when she was an intern there, she was killed in a bicycle accident on the way to work. She'd asked, basically in her first or second week, how do I get to the office? And someone had said, oh, well, you live up there, you take this main road and you get in there. And she was knocked over by a lorry or a truck at a truck junction and died. The director of the institute then left the institute and went into Downing Street. And the story of her sort of example, which was that had she taken a different route to work, the one that almost everybody else took, she didn't know about it because she was just new in town and had kind of moved to London in order to take this interview, she would probably still have been alive. And it was something that came into his head when Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the internet, was looking for an example to give to the British cabinet of how open data can really make a difference in people's lives. And it's sort of the power of when you drop a penny and it makes a big clang and people actually finally get something very powerful. And this was the example that they gave, because he had wondered if the government somewhere locked in the sort of closets that Andrew goes rummaging in had data on bicycle deaths, on sort of accident black spots. And so someone in Downing Street made a call to someone in the minister's office that runs the transport department and said, do you have this data? And they said, yeah, we do have this data. What do you want with it? And they said, well, we'd like to publish it. And they were like, well, why do you want to do that? And after a little bit of toing and froing, which ended with the fact that the Prime Minister wanted them to publish it, they did it. And they waited to see what would happen. The supposition being that somebody would find something useful to do with it. And what happened was that within a day, someone had taken this data and turned it into the type of data that could be put together with a mapping application. And then within one more day, someone else had come along and built a very nice website on the back of it, which allowed you to put in your postcode on Google Maps and map your journey into work. And along the side of it, you could see any bicycle accident black spots. So that it was pretty easy to see if you wanted to get to work, this was the route you should take and this was the route you shouldn't take. And that was the example that Tim Berners-Lee, who I guess most people here would probably know as the man who invented the World Wide Web, sort of stood up in front of the British cabinet and gave as an example of how powerful this could be. And it's particularly powerful if you think about the opposite, which is what would have happened if a government department had decided to commission a website that would tell you about bicycle accident black spots. And Tim is very sort of amusing about this as he takes you through the process, which is that there would have been a policy review about bicycle accident black spots. There would have been a process of evidence gathering. That would have then led to at least a team of 3 or 4 civil servants spending about a month doing a tender document. That tender document would have gone out to open competition. It would have had to have gone through the European Union open competition rules, which are Byzantine to say the least. That would then have happened. Then there would have been competing bids. You'd have looked at it. It would have gone out to someone. You know, you'd have paid. By this time, you'd already have racked up at least £1 million. Someone would have built the thing. It wouldn't have worked very well because they never do when you do it on this route. Then you'd have had to pay them to look after it. The end result would almost certainly have been a kind of a disaster that no one would have used. And I mean, I know that Andrew doesn't do any of these such projects, but my government has funded a fair number of them. And at the end of it, you'd have had a website which would probably have cost you about £5 million that no one would have used, that would have sort of sat there gathering dust until someone like Andrew would have come along and killed it. Instead of which, just by putting the data up there on the web, for a grand total of, you know, probably something like 10,000 quid, effectively nothing, you had a good usable website that was making a real difference to anyone who used it. And it was that one story that somehow managed to convince the British cabinet that this was worth doing, that there was something to be had there. And so under Gordon Brown's direction, Tim Berners-Lee was sent off around the British government and sort of burrowed away for 6 months trying to convince more departments to do what Andrew does, which is to give them their data. I don't know if, did any of you see his talk at TED about a year ago, where he led a couple of thousand enthusiastic Californians in a chant of get raw data now, and sort of had everyone up on their seat. Get raw data now. And you have this sort of balding, nerdy British guy with a slightly transatlantic accent leading 2,000 overexcitable, overcaffeinated Californians in a yelling football chant of get raw data now. And it was quite something to... Anyway, so his task was to go around the British government and persuade everyone of this. And I came across this story just before Christmas, so not too long ago now, only sort of 3 or 4 months ago, because I heard that he'd actually succeeded. And I knew this was going on, but I sort of imagined that, as with every other one of these projects, that he would have run into a wall, that eventually somebody would have told him that he couldn't do it. It was too expensive. It was much too difficult. Even though the Prime Minister wanted this to happen, it couldn't happen, or it couldn't happen in reasonable cost and a reasonable timetable. And then, in particular in Britain, we have an issue with mapping data, which for those of you who aren't nerdy, if you talk to people who are nerdy, they'll tell you that the type of data that really matters, the one that you really have to have, is geospatial data, so you can put things on maps. In your country, you have a great system of doing this, which is you pay for it out of tax and give it away for free. We have a different system, which is a real pain, where we get people to pay for it on a per-use basis. And it's been the kind of jihad of people like me to get our system changed. And it's incredibly difficult because it means you've got to spend some money doing it, and then it becomes problematic. Anyway, it turned out that he'd managed to do it. And so the question which I set out to tell in this newspaper article is, how did this happen? How was it that there'd been a group of us who've been trying to convince people that this is a good idea for about 10 years? When I'm not a journalist, I have worked in the British government, but I'm also a trustee of a charity called mysociety.org, which I think on the little green blob there that was the fourth of 4, which said UK in Andrew's example, you'd have... Which My Society websites did you have on there? That's right, yeah. Okay, so Fix My Street is a website where you can put in your postcode anytime you find like a pothole or a burnt out car or who knows what. You can report that. It will go straight to the local authority. They will then tag that they've got it and sort of say when they've fixed it. They Work For You is a version of the equivalent of the Congressional Record for the British Parliament, which doesn't suck like the old one did. And so My Society is this little charity with sort of 10 geeks in it who do civic website projects. Anyway, so I just got interested in this. How was it that Tim Berners-Lee had managed to do this thing? And there's a sort of interesting story of how this sort of uber nerd had gone in and basically used a mixture of celebrity, a panic inside our government. I don't know if any of you have heard, we had a big scandal about parliamentary expenses in which it transpired that a lot of our members of parliament had been using parliamentary expenses to buy things that they weren't meant to be buying, like the word that had entered the British lexicon over the last 6 months is duck house, which was a house that you put in the middle of your lake that you own if you're an extremely rich conservative politician. And it's a house built specifically for ducks. And it's a sort of wooden house about kind of yay big with a little sort of duck walk. And anyway, one of these got charged to the state along with various sort of light bulbs and chocolate bars. And yep, someone had his moat cleaned. That's right. You know, that is true. I pay for my own moat to be cleaned, but so that partly Gordon Brown, who is not a very technologically minded politician, panicked, and suddenly anyone who was wandering around with a sort of thing in their hand marked transparency became very interesting because it became an answer to this crisis of political legitimacy. Also because Tim Berners-Lee, in his own little way, is quite a famous guy, and he was able to use his celebrity to sort of ungum the bits of government where people would hear, oh, you want to talk about data? Well, you can go and talk to this guy over in the corner, and you're not talking to the people who made the decisions. And he had a sort of deceptively simple model, which is he would turn up in a meeting with the minister or the what we call the kind of the permanent secretary, the head civil servant, and he'd just ask them for the data. He'd sort of sit down and talk enthusiastically in terms that they didn't understand about the semantic web and open data and metadata tagging, and they'd look bemused, but they'd be in the room with the man who founded the internet, and so then they'd give him what they wanted. And it was this remarkable process where a mixture of celebrity and panic came together. And at the end of this, we got our own version of data.gov called data.gov.uk with consummate originality. And so I'm told ours is better than yours, quite a bit better. And so you have this situation now in Britain where people sort of get that this is sort of useful and interesting. It has what it has never had before, which is purchase within the system as a kind of an innovative project. It's something that while local government agencies aren't signed up at, most of the central government departments have people who now think this is important. And then the next thing which is going to happen is we have an opposition party who are much, much more radical than the governing party. And this, I think, is kind of where I want to sort of come to the conclusion of this, which is that there is going to be, or there should be, a political battle here. And I just want to kind of explain why. So David Cameron is a sort of conservative who would get 0% in the CPAC straw poll that's going to happen on Saturday morning. I mean, he's a sort of relatively sensible, sort of socially liberal, moderate, technologically friendly 21st century conservative. And I find much of what he stands for rather attractive. I mean, he certainly on this agenda has been extraordinarily forward-looking. He took over a party 4 years ago which was as technologically backward-looking as it's almost possible to get, to the point where his team, they had an internal phrase which was bring backery, and they said they were going to ban bring backery. So anyone who wanted to bring back hanging or birching or flogging or just anything which suggested that the 19th century was the high point of human civilization and everything had gone downhill with the end of the First World War was to be banned. And he became relentlessly optimistic and technologically sort of minded. And the end result of this, he has a narrative about the coming post-bureaucratic age, which is not that different to the one that Simon would tell you about, which is a world in which technology is pervasive, people are more powerful, the state has to adapt to the new aspirations of its people. And it's getting some real policy purchase. Last week he gave a talk at this year's TED conference, not the one that Tim Berners-Lee was at, in which he announced that his government would publish all government contracts, the details of all of them in everything. And it sort of sounds nerdy, but if you think about what American politics would have been like over the last 4 or 5 years if that had been true, it would have made an astonishing difference. Every Kellogg Brown and Root contract in Iraq, every advisory firm that came in to run a bust bank, every person who got any money through the stimulus, anything at all, if all of that was open, it would create an enormous ruckus, and to the point where I'm still not sure this is actually going to happen because it's so radical. But as a promise, it really shows that they're pretty serious about this. They promise that they're going to create a new database for every bit of government spending over about £25,000. a whole range of other things. And wrapped up in this is this narrative of the post-bureaucratic age, which is their big play about what the world is going to be like and how politics has to respond. And as I say, why this matters is it talks to, three pretty big changes. The first that Andrew has outlined is technological. This technological revolution isn't going away, it's sort of speeding up. The second is a sort of pressing reality that we all have to think about, which is how do you do more with less in government in an era that's going to go on for at least a decade, where there's just not as much money to go around, and the aspirations of people are not getting less, they're getting more. And this helps you to do that. And the third is fundamentally to do with people and what they're capable of. The reason why the post-bureaucratic age narrative that Cameron has is so powerful is it recognizes that there used to, as Andrew said with his metaphor at the beginning, that there used to be a time in which only large, powerful institutions could do things, and that if you were an individual or a sort of loose collaborative of, or a sort of small community organization, there wasn't really all that much that you could do. And that has changed as people have become better educated, more capable, they have more self-efficacy. You bring those three things together, and it's a very combustible political proposition. And the question of which side gets there first, is it the right or the left, the conservative side or the progressive side, is an interesting one. And it's as important, I think, an issue as exists in politics at the moment. Yesterday at CPAC, I'm here partly writing an article about the state of the American right. And it was interesting that John Boehner stood up and talked about if he was speaker, he would introduce a program of radical transparency. Clearly, it's not quite starving the beast, it's sort of shining a light on the beast in order to starve it later. And there's an agenda developing there that you see in the Tea Party movement and in the Congressional Republicans, in which if you fundamentally think government is a bad thing, if you sort of shine lots of lights on its inadequacies, then you can sort of shame it into shrinking somehow. And that will be a very powerful agenda. On the other hand, on the progressive side, if you think, as Andrew does and Simon does and I do, that sort of government has something to offer, then equally you have to sort of engage with this agenda and realize that it redraws the boundary between the citizen and the state. If the citizen can do more, then sometimes government has to do less, but as Andrew's sort of example shows, there's still an enormous role for the state here to provide better data, to enable frameworks in which people can use it in interesting ways. Sometimes you can't rely on people outside to build new services. You have to do it yourself. So anyway, if you don't start having this battle, then you will cede it, I think, to the other side. But what you will see in our election is not just a country that I think probably has in many ways sort of overtaken America in its ability to think about this, to have its government engaged in it, and also to have sort of innovative organizations like My Society outside. But you will see it begin to become a real sort of site of political contestation, and I would expect that to happen here too. And I think it's a moot question as to which side wins, but I think it's definitely a battle worth having, so I'll leave it at that for now.
Both of you, that was incredibly interesting. Andrew, I thought the way that you did your presentation was neat and cool, and thank you for that. We're happy to take your questions, comments, suggestions. Also, for those of you watching online, if you're still here, follow the directions on your screen, and we'll try to take them from upstairs down here into Sam's email, and so far away. And we're gonna, if you can speak into the mic, because this is being broadcast or live cast. Go ahead.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yep. This is Ian Milheiser with Center for American Progress, and my question is largely for Andrew, but other people feel free to jump in. It's about scalability. When you look at the sites that the White House has been pushing, they seem to fall into two typologies. You've got the IT dashboard, which is focused on a really narrow problem. How do you make sure that our IT programs are being done well and efficiently and aren't wasteful? And because of the narrowness of that problem, you can have really, really good metrics. So I can go to the IT dashboard and figure out how good an individual project is really easily. I can compare similar projects and see which ones are going better. And so there's a lot I can learn if I'm really, really geeked out about government IT procurement, about how well government is doing its job, what things work well, and what lessons we can learn from the future. The other end of the spectrum is something like usaspending.gov, where you have a ton of information. And, if I want to find out that Land O'Lakes received an $80 million contract to sell cheese to the government, I can learn that. But I can't learn, would the nutritional needs of that cheese was met to be learned better have been served through butter. I can't learn if there was another company that could have done it better. I can't learn if a particular contract was really a governmental function that should have been done by government employees rather than by a contractor. It's very, very difficult for me to answer the question, like, was this done well? The only question I can answer really is what was done. And my question is, what are your thoughts on scalability? Can something like the IT dashboard be scaled so that you can have the level of detail you have on recovery.gov or usaspending.gov, but still be able to answer those questions of what is government doing that works?
So let me answer it this way, which is, so both of those two kinds of sites basically rest on data that's got metadata, right? So Tim Berners-Lee in the UK actually has taken this very militant view, which is that government should not be in the business of visualizing. He's kind of softened that a little bit. You can visualize some stuff if you want to, but he really believes, don't even HTMLify it. Just get it out there in raw data forms, and then, because you're always inherently going to color the data one way or another. Let the data speak for itself. So my view is that the real trick is to get the data out there with good, solid metadata that explains what it is, tags it properly, tells you what's there, and then whether you do then the site, which is essentially just a visualization of the data, it's just a presentation layer that lives on top of it. The site doesn't really matter so much, right? The data that lies under USA spending, the data that lies under the IT dashboard is accessible through an open API, and then you let people just kind of grab what they want and derive meaning from it however they want. You should be able to to use search and search of the metadata, search of the data, to be able to compile tables. Actually, Microsoft has a really nice tool that they've just released called Pivot, which I commend to you. It is still Windows only, so I've only played around with it on other people's machines. But it's a very nice tool that is basically a very impressively souped up way to draw sensible meaning out of a vast soup of data. Anyway, it's one way that you can sort of draw on. Anyway, I think about this in terms of different kinds of visualization, not so much in terms of scaling. Scaling is all about just get the data. To me, it's just get the data out there at whatever scale data set you've got. And then the visualization presentation question is, how do you do that? I think what we're still missing right now is the kind of integrated search function with a presentation layer on top of the results that allows you to really super flexibly pick the things that you're interested in and get them presented to you in a way that makes sense.
James, do you want to?
I do actually. I mean, it sort of seems to me that there's both of those things really matter in different ways. The reason why Tim took this militant view is that if you suddenly let people who run government departments decide what to do with the data, then they screw it up, because they look at it and they think, well, how can we make this data do the last thing it was that we were told to be doing? And so suddenly you'll find that the sites that you put out are, I don't know, you were doing a big initiative on obesity, so the data that you have is put out there in a site that's about, I don't know, how do you make children thin, as opposed to the other things that it could be used for. So in that sense, I think that there is some wisdom in the notion that if you allow officials in government departments to present data in the way that makes sense to them, the likelihood is that they'll screw it up because they'll have different bureaucratic incentives. On the other hand, visualization is crucially important, and I don't really think people have sort of got a handle on how important it is. Because if you put data in the wrong context, if you don't make it readily understandable, you'll struggle to get particularly ordinary, sort of regular folks to use it. It has to be very intuitive, and the context in which it arrives is crucial. I mean, in Britain we don't have a schools comparison website. I mean, it's in the age of sort of being able to compare all sorts of financial products. The fact that you don't have a website that will allow you sensibly to compare schools is a disgrace. And all of that data exists, and the reason why it's not out there is just a simple sort of bureaucratic inertia and producer capture and crappy trade unions and all sorts of stuff that hopefully will change. But if you were to imagine a really good schools comparison website, you've got to be very, very careful how you present that data, what is seen to be a sort of legitimate thing that you would want to compare on, how you would stop making people making bad decisions because they didn't understand exactly what the data meant. I mean, the reason why this stuff matters is it helps people make better decisions about their lives, and it underpins new businesses. That's sort of basically what you get out of this. And if you don't provide people with data that helps them make better decisions, you can certainly provide them with information that will help them make worse decisions. And so context matters a lot, and within that, visualization is hugely important. So I don't quite know how you bring those two things together. I mean, that's a bit of a conundrum. I think in Britain what you try and do is you let the government put the data out there, and you hope out of this comes a sort of benign ecosystem out there in the sort of NGO community who will be able to find good and responsible ways of doing this. But I think it is a good tension to play around with.
Right here.
Thank you. Especially Andrew, but both of you, you talked about some of the issues you encountered, especially legally with dealing with releasing data and what that involves culturally inside organizations. And something that I'm interested in is agencies and government grappling with open source and actually releasing their own things that they do. You know, I know that HHS ran codeathons and everything to try to get people involved, but you know, as an example, you know, what's stopping data.gov and data.gov.uk from releasing the source code that they wrote for their to lower the barrier for other countries to do things like that. You know, almost. I don't know if I can think of a single federal agency that has released source code to much of anything that they've done. And as the flip side of this equation is also adoption of open source technologies within governments. I know at the municipal level in the States, San Francisco has mandated that that open source technologies be given equal consideration with proprietary ones during the bidding process. But I haven't seen that really get into the federal level.
Well,
so those are two issues.
You're preaching to the choir on the first point, right? So when taxpayers pay to have source code developed by the government anyway, now there are arguments why when you buy it proprietarily, you know, we believe in the proprietary software model in this country, like letting companies write software code that they can then protect in order to be able to sell it is a good thing, right? We believe in that. But we also believe that, you know, when the taxpayers pay for the government to do something and it does that something in-house, you'd better have a pretty good reason for why that shouldn't be public. That's the principle we apply to data. If the taxpayers are paying for the data to be collected, then there should be a reason why you're not making it public, so the default is public. In the case of source code, there are some reasons why you may not want to make things public. But as the open source community has shown, there are many other good reasons to make source code available because it allows you to improve it, protect it, bash it, identify flaws, and so forth. So I sincerely hope that you will see a more concerted effort to try to get government coders in the habit of sharing their code with each other. That would be a nice small step. And then sharing their code publicly. You mentioned developing countries. I mean, I think one of the things that has been very much present in Secretary Clinton's agenda internationally has been, you know, aligning the United States with you know, our international positions with our domestic agenda. So internationally, you know, she's taken a strong position in favor of freedom of expression and free speech. I think she's also been advocating strongly in favor of government reform in countries that we deal with. You know, how do you open up your governments so that your people have more trust in you, so that they understand where their money's going? And she's spoken about that a couple of times. I would love to see the work that we're doing be easily replicatable, really just downloadable. We're going to have to take some steps before we get there, but you know, one endpoint that I'd like to see is something like a SourceForge for government coders, right? I mean, a site that collects coding projects and has good version control and allows people to, you know, kind of contribute in an open manner.
I like this game because we're going to do this. The Conservatives have promised that any code developed as part of a project paid for by the government will be public and open source after the next election. And that's sort of the benefit of we have, as Andrew said, we have this sort of fantastically centralized system. And so we're in this odd moment when you know, ideas like this can just sort of get dropped into policy. And a little bit like the open contracts idea, it's such a radical idea that almost the only way you can have something like this happen, it's very difficult to let it kind of bubble up through the system. You just sort of say you're going to do it at the top and then fight your way through and see if somebody manages to stop you. But anyway, they say they're going to do exactly that. And yeah, so as you say, there probably will be some downsides to it. Some people may decide they don't want to bid for government contracts anymore because they'll be forced to give away some of their previously proprietary code. But I suspect it will be fine. You know, it'll be a good idea, and people will look at it and wonder why we didn't do it before. But anyway, so yeah, give us a couple of months, we'll be there.
I'm going to tell one quick story, which is I was on a delegation trip recently to meet with a foreign government about some of these matters, and with a bunch of technology folks. And in the meeting, there was a question asked the government about, did they have a certain data about murders and assassinations and killings that had happened in a particular place, and would they release it? And there were 10 government officials sitting there. The question was asked, dead silence, right? And we're talking about a couple hundred people, right? We're not talking thousands and thousands, it was a couple hundred people. The meeting stopped. The tech person who was with us asked again, do you have the data? Would you release it to the public? They all looked at each other, the 10 bureaucrats there, and they looked at each other again. There was about a minute and a half of silence, and they said no. And it was an amazing moment, right, in this idea is that we were going there to help them with this problem they had of assassinations and killings and murders. And this is a government-to-government meeting in a private government building, asking whether they actually had the data. And of course they had the data, right? And the response to the American delegation was, well, we don't know, and so-and-so doesn't have it. And so going from where this is, what you just saw today, for other countries, I mean, this is going to be an extraordinary thing to watch it play out, even in the sort of the next tier of developed nations, because governments have an historic, I mean, openness, this whole concept of openness, right, I think is such a, and this open and closed discussion is going to be such an extraordinary one to see play out over, the next few years, which is why the leadership, one of the reasons we wanted to bring together what was happening in the UK with what was happening here, because this is a movement. I mean, this is something bigger than a bunch of geeks sitting in a room dumping data on the street. Right? I mean, this is about a fundamental change of government's understanding of their role in civil society, and we got a lot of work to do, in the next few years. Nelson, go ahead. Go ahead, Nelson.
Nelson Cunningham. Andrew, that was absolutely fascinating. And keying off the point that you just made, Simon, about we're opening up government to civil society and how will that change the way we think about government. My question for Andrew particularly in this political moment here is, what does the Tea Party think of what you're doing here?
Well, I got to say, I am personally psyched. I would be thrilled if we can make this a point of political competition. In other words, if the various points in the American political spectrum can be made to compete to see who can be more radical in their transparency efforts, more radical in their participation model, more radical in their collaboration, that would be a great political dynamic to have. One, really interesting example is the first time I saw a political dynamic like that break out, just personally anyway, was in Spain, where, anyway, about 10 years ago, I was visiting the Basque region and was in a meeting there, and the moderately separatist premier of the Basque region was incredibly proud that they had put up an online system that made the finances of the province very transparent. So what he showed me was you can see how much the agriculture department spent on FedExes 3 months ago. So whatever accounting period that they were, whenever they closed the books, basically, even before audit, when they closed the books, they just put that data out and then they marked what was audited and not audited. Well, anyway, I was fascinated by this, and so the political dynamic that gave rise to it, though, was that the Basque region, the Catalan region, which are occasionally governed by sort of moderate separatists, are trying to prove to their citizens that they can run a better government than those people in Madrid. And by consequence, the government in Madrid has had to respond to try to prove that it can run a trustworthy, reliable, transparent government. What's interesting to me about the Tea Party movement is that in this country we have this very different political dynamic, though, where angry protest is kind of part of the game, like the sort of the kind of ethic of government in this country or the sort of, ethics is the wrong word, the kind of broad skepticism of government is just part of the American character, right? Like we are left and right kind of inherently skeptical about government. And so I actually think that, whether you're like me and you believe in an effective but limited government, or you're on the right and you believe in a limited but limited government, the same underlying dynamic can be put to work, or the sort of political instinct can be put to work to try to make the government more open, more collaborative, more participatory, and all that, for extremely different political reasons, but with the same kind of effect if we sort of do it right. Anyway, that's why I would be delighted if the Republicans started pumping out awesome transparency ideas like the Conservatives have been doing in the UK that we can then try to match and top.
Hey Sam, where'd you go? Right here. This guy's been jumping up and down.
Hi, I had a couple questions. I'll abbreviate them. I was curious about data quality, and we've got two examples of two different countries where you're coordinating or inspiring the sub-agencies to put up their data, but the data may not be of good quality. So how do you overcome a perception that the data is not ready to be released?
This is one of the biggest, this is actually an incredibly important, nerdy, but really important issue, which is that there is a tradition in the federal government, the federal agencies, of really high quality data. If you look at the Commerce Department and the statistics that they put out every week, you look at the Census Bureau, you look at the EPA, you look at all these different agencies, Interior, there are these, and I've been meeting a lot of them, there are these incredible professionals who spend their professional lives trying to produce the highest quality data that they can get. And there's a tension between sort of, people like me jumping around saying, get it online, get it online, get it online. And the traditions that they have of not publishing anything until they are darn sure that it's, up to the quality standards that they expect. They believe that the federal government should never be a source of misleading data. So that's something we got to respect, and I think it's a value that's worth preserving. At the same time, though, we do have many cases where we publish data with qualifiers about the level of confidence we have in it. The GDP numbers get revised, for example, I think twice after they get published. So you publish the number that you think you got, and you do some qualifiers, and then 3 months later you update it, and then 3 months later you update it again. We know how to do that, and so I think some of what we're going to have to do is figure out modi operandi that will enable us to accelerate the pace at which we're publishing data and protect the quality standards that we want, and then appropriately qualify where we are varying from the sort of super platinum-plated standards that the government has adhered to in the past. Anyway, you put your finger on a really important problem there.
Sam, would you go over here, and then we'll take one more after that.
Hi, I'm Kim Hart with the Hill newspaper. I had a question about one of the things that you run into a lot at agencies like the FCC, where they're collecting tons and tons and tons of data, especially for the National Broadband Plan that's coming out. But all, per the agency's rules, all a company like AT&T or Verizon has to do is say that the data that they're handing over to the FCC is proprietary, and then the FCC doesn't or can't let anyone else see it. And in doing so, some have said that really hampers the FCC's ability to let citizens help them with their problems, which is something that they've also been preaching. Do you have any thoughts about that, either of you or any of you, about how you can maybe get around the issue of companies not wanting some really interesting and helpful data out just because they don't want it out?
I mean, again, to go back to this announcement about government contracts, that is exactly the same argument that's been made about that. You can't put any government contract data out there because even if you were able to see how the contract was structured, you'd be able to infer what a company's sort of strategy was. There'd be lots of IP in there, all sorts of stuff that you couldn't do. And in the end, you just have to tell them that these are the rules, and if you don't want them, then you don't get the contract and we'll give it to somebody else. Now, if you're in a situation where you already have those rules and you don't have people who are willing to do that, then the best way around it is to figure out, or certainly we've found the best way around it, is to figure out one kind of killer publicly friendly application that you could do if these rules were changed somehow, and make that your kind of cause célèbre. So one of the ones that worked quite well in Britain was free school meals. So it's an indicator of whether whether sort of disadvantaged kids, the help they get from the state. If you're really poor, you get your meals at school provided for free. But the process by which you do that takes about 2 weeks. It's sort of you have to post off somewhere. Anyway, if they could just join up a few databases behind the scenes, then you could do it on the same day, and you wouldn't have to be kind of humiliated by going to the front of the class. And that single example helped to sort of drive a wedge through the system in which people decided that it had to be changed. And I suppose there's probably technical things you can do about anonymizing and sort of technical workarounds that you can say. But those two examples, I mean, one, companies need government contracts, so you just set the rules and tell them these are the rules, and most of them will change their behavior, I think. And if they don't, then you probably have gone too far. And then really fantastic examples of what you can do that you can kind of sell to politicians that there's real benefit to be had here.
I would just say this, this is not a new problem. This has been, government wanting to get data from companies about various and sundry things has been going on for decades and decades. I guess my view is you take the common law approach, which you just got to kind of work it out. There's data that companies hold and collect. A classic example would be like, I don't know, a chemical company and its spills of toxic chemicals, into the groundwater or something like that. That's data that there's a clear public interest in getting, and even if the chemical company says it's proprietary, you're likely to not buy that explanation. On the other hand, there's data like if the government said we want everybody to post the names of the customers that they've been cold calling lately, that there's no public interest in that. That really is proprietary data. If the government said we want everybody to post their annual strategy for the so you just got to kind of work it out. I haven't honestly spent much time focused on the FCC stuff, but there's a balance. You got to respect. We don't, as a government, want to distort markets. Like we don't. You don't want to force people to publish data that's going to hamper their competitive position. You do want to get the data that you need to make good public policy, and I'm sure the FCC is working their way through that.
We'll take one more. Yes, sir, in the back.
Scott Rafferty. I had a question. I'd be interested in the British analogy to this, but about two processes which have always been very tightly linked to paper. The rulemaking process and who's doing the best job of having a process which is not only transparent but also manageable and reviewable by the agency and by a court. And secondly, electronic record keeping, because traditionally we've had the Federal Records Act, which essentially requires about 98% of the things on paper to be destroyed. Is that still relevant? And what agencies are moving toward electronic record keeping, which is FOIA compliant and provides archiving significant historical documents?
Well, so let me just give two just very short answers to that. Each of those questions could detain us for sort of an hour or more. But we've got a sort of, as part of the White House Open Government Initiative, we're looking at e-rulemaking, which is really like how do you shift rulemaking into a web environment. The thing that was nice about paper was that there was so much process leading up to it that it really hardened the process. It really meant that it was a nice backstop to make sure that you had checked all the boxes. A Federal Register notice was really kind of a thing of, where all four corners were square and the T's were crossed and all that. And so when you move online, you don't want to encourage agencies to become sloppy and just say well, let's throw some proposed rules out there. Let's see what happens. You don't want to overwhelm people with, so many opportunities to comment that, so focus also has to be part of e-rulemaking. How do you maintain standards of quality? How do you maintain the level of care and concern that goes into formulation of these kinds of things? Anyway, I won't say more than that, just that it's part of the thing that OMB and the White House Open Government Initiative are looking at, which is how do you do it and how do you gin up some experiments. My colleague Beth Novick in the White House has really been leading on that, and she's much smarter about it than I am. On the second one of record keeping, the National Archives is actually working pretty hard on that right now. They've got two advisory committees that are looking at sort of the archival consequences of moving everything online and dealing with things like what do you do with documents that are in proprietary formats? How do you convert them into a format that we can keep, for eternity without having to, keep paying paying licensing fees to a software manufacturer forever. They've sort of worked their way through that. And on the White House side, I'll just note that the Presidential Records Act, which has an important role and provenance in the post-Nixon era and all that, and so forth, but it does get in the way of some of the things we want to do. You know, White House had to go out and contract for a particular system to archive Twitter and Facebook profile comments because you know, we have to keep them. They're things that are coming, they're communications coming into the White House that, you know, would normally just disappear into the ether after a little while. But we've had to come up with a way to reliably and with integrity keep snapshots of those comments and make sure that we keep them forever. So anyway, National Archives is the.
I mean, I don't really know how to answer your specific questions, but it's a thought that I've always had, which is history is a kind of weird one on the internet. You'd have thought that history was something the internet would do fantastically well, but oddly, it's one of the things the internet does worst of all. Like if you try and find information on the internet about this building, who built it, why it was built, what was here before, who used to live here, you know, what's in it, what's beneath it, it's incredibly difficult. If you look at genealogy, you know, one area where you do actually have really good data online, it's fantastically popular. People absolutely love it. And, you know, there's all sorts of reasons for this. There's no particular reason if you're a records holder that you want to put all this stuff on the internet. You don't have budget for it. It's a pain. Often these are delicate documents. You're not quite sure how to do it. How do you keep control of it? And there's a sort of blockage here that is stopping a real flowering of. It would be a fantastic thing if you could make the internet more historical, whether it's the sort of the street or the building, your family, sort of society in general, you know, the legacy of government policy making, for instance. I mean, I used to work in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit in the UK, and the way in which you kept documents was completely useless. I mean, when the last civil servant who had the last email with the last document in that email left, nobody could remember when the last project was done. So I don't know. I mean, I say only that I recognize it as a problem, and that it's something that's worthy of somebody's attention to try and figure out how you get more of these documents online. Because when you do that, it will be, you know, I think it will be a sort of fantastic flowering of interest in, you know, what was in this building or why someone built it or that kind of thing. But it's certainly something that we're nowhere close to doing yet.
Gentlemen, before we go, any final thoughts?
No, thanks for hosting the thanks for hosting the event. It's nice to geek out in friendly company.
Yeah, thank you.
Do take your free copy of Prospect Magazine on the way out. We ship them all the way over here, so we're not taking them home.
Thanks, gentlemen, very much.